Hello, I'm Eric Landrum from the Psych Sessions Network and also a Season 3 co host of Teaching Matters, along with co host Dr. Rob McIntarfer from Lincoln Public Schools in Lincoln, Nebraska. We're pleased to bring you this collection of 10 episodes recorded from September 2021 through April 2022. Two episodes in Season 3 featured guests. In Episode 4, we speak with Casey Swanson from Plymouth High School in Canton, Michigan. And in Episode 10, we speak with Ginger Wickline from Georgia Southern University in Statesboro, Georgia. As usual, a wide range of topics are discussed across these 10 episodes. Here is just a sample: research methods, student mental health, hypothesis testing, fictions teachers tell themselves, self care tips, assessment chat, rubrics, AP psychology, IB psychology, high school teachers making connections with college teachers, understanding graphs, accreditation, rather than doing more, purposely doing less, the subjectivity of grading, study skills advice, modality switching during the semester, adapting to natural disasters in one's life, using storytelling purposely as a teaching strategy, the professional demeanor at conferences, improv for teachers, why oh why extra credit, STP's This Is How I Teach blog, hearing the diverse voices of teachers of psychology, and so much more. Please enjoy Season 3 of Teaching Matters from Psych Sessions. Welcome back to another episode of Teaching Matters. Hey, I'm here with Rob McIntarfer from Lincoln Public Schools. I'm Eric Landrum from Boise State University. Why the formal introduction? Well, in real time, Rob and I haven't seen each other, it feels like, for about a month, but hi, Rob.
Hi, Eric. It's really good to see you
It's
again.
great to
Li
see you again.
Life keeps getting in the way of this much more important thing that you and I get to do every week.
The That is true. So, the amazing amount of prep that we do and our shared volumes of spreadsheet files that we have, and the back and forth that we go furiously before each recording, and all of that was just a lie. We normally have something to talk about, and Rob was about to graciously tell me what it was before I clicked on record. I said, "No, no, wait, just spring it on me." So Rob thankfully has a topic to talk about. I have no idea what it is. Dr. McIntarfer, whenever you're ready.
This one's really unfair because I've had time to think about it, and you may want to have time to think about it too. But given the time of year, everybody in my district is pretty exhausted. We're about to go on spring break. I don't know where you are in your second semester schedule, but I know several people, teachers, who are making choices today to do something a bit lighter that still required students to think, but to do a little bit lighter right before a break. So if we want to continue in that, I thought you and I could just tell teaching stories, which is a pretty big open-ended prompt. But like favorite teaching stories, maybe stories that you love sharing with an intro psych class that gets people engaged and thinking every time because they illustrate a concept, or the stories that you tell at the hotel beverage establishment at a conference that people really like to hear, history of psychology, favorite tidbits, any and all open stories.
Sure. Well, that first off, great topic. It didn't blindside me at all. But I want to actually go back to the initial premise, which is,
Yeah.
faculty members are thinking about, doing something lighter as we head into spring break. And, faculty members, they beat up on themselves so much. And, it's only lighter in the faculty member's mind in comparison of the what the Rolodex tells them what they could select from. It's not lighter
Yeah.
to the student. It's the student is doing the assignment they're given. So they didn't
Right.
know they're getting lighter, and it still might be quite difficult to the student. So
It's a good
the
point.
the faculty member, my gentle advice would be cut yourself some slack,
Yeah.
because lighter is not necessarily less difficult. If lighter means less grading for you, all the more power to you. Give it, and I've just gotten back on social media just in the past 3 weeks, and
Mhm.
I think our friend, pal, colleague Steve Chu made a comment on Twitter, I think, about, well, here comes spring break. I'm getting ready to get caught up. And it's like, I get that. That'll help a lot of teachers and faculty members feel good. Maybe spring break ought to be about rejuvenation and recharging and reconnecting with friends or family or self-care, and not about work, work, work. Again, and but people have to do what they need to do. So anyway, end of sermon.
Boy, do I feel that because I'm considering, and talking with you is causing me to reconsider it a bit too. With my AP, my 4 AP researchers, they are deep in data analysis from the data that they've gathered for their final project. We did some practice on a practice survey that they helped develop way back when, and I sent out to administrators, and we have some data back from that. And my purpose of getting those data back was to giving them some data analysis experience, and they learned about spreadsheets and filters and count if functions and split functions, and we even went to pivot tables.
Awesome.
And so they've got some descriptive statistics tools they can use on their data. My original intent was that they would do the analysis on the sample data and write up full results sections using that analysis to give them practice writing the results section. And we just simply ran out of time. That was way too ambitious. So they wrote a little bit on the results section. We
Sure.
divided and conquered it. So they got a little bit of experience. But getting back to the point, I'm considering over spring break writing up the results section myself because some of the data are actually interesting. But maybe I should just take spring break off. I'm not sure.
Well, it, you know, it's a yeah. I think it's a yes. And would writing that up over spring break be enjoyable to you? I
Yeah,
mean,
maybe I'll start
would
and
that
see
be
how it feels.
fun?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And if it
I may
would
start and see how
be,
it feels. Yeah.
yeah, but I, you know, and I think Rob, in this particular case, you've given those students a high school experience that 99.99% of high school students in the nation will never have. So if you don't get to your own incredibly high bar, it's going to be okay. Even if the college board has a curriculum all mapped out that tells you you have to get to everything,
Yeah.
it just might mean that they get a 4 rather than a 5 on their AP
Right.
exam, or
Right.
they get a 5 rather than a 5 plus, or whatever the thing is. The
Yeah.
real moral of the story is they're gonna be well prepared for college or whatever comes next, regardless if they even took the AP Advanced Research Methods test.
Thanks. That's obviously my hope. And actually, when I was making some teaching choices for this class, I was thinking of some of our discussions because when everybody who's taught research methods and or stats know you've got to make choices about how deep to go with statistical training. And with high schoolers, knew I needed to think even more critically about that. So I ended up thinking about our conversation and some of your work about transferable skills. And so I made some deliberate choices to only teach them analysis that they could use using tools that they have and will have available to them. So we're not even talking about SPSS or SAS or even some of the free stat packages out there.
Yeah,
I decided I had to discipline myself to only do stuff that they can do inside Google spreadsheets and only show them how to do stuff inside Google spreadsheets. And that's it. End of story. And that means that we won't go as far as these students are capable of doing independent samples t-tests or chi-squares. And I think that's possible with a lot of gymnastics inside a Google spreadsheet, but we may not even get there. They may just end up with what I hope really solid skills they can use to do descriptive statistics on data sets inside Google spreadsheets. And that may be it.
and Rob, I think if your students could understand measures of central tendency and measures of variability, they could really
Hmm.
understand a mean and a standard deviation. And if
Hmm.
they could interpret graphs
Yeah.
by the end of high school, and I'll go one further, if psych majors could understand what I just said by the end of college,
Right.
I think that would be great because the students who are going into the psychology workforce If they need something more advanced, their workforce training will give it to them. The students going to graduate school, they will get another 1-year sequence of training likely in their graduate program.
Yeah.
If a student at whatever level could understand measures of central tendency and measures of variability, I mean, really understand it conceptually and understand, be able to interpret graphs, charts, figures, and not shy away from it. And they could apply that to work or to graduate school or to life or reading a newspaper or reading about Ukraine in the news, and when
Yeah.
journalists are writing about what's going on there and they can interpret the data for themselves, that would be a huge gift. So yeah, learning SPSS or R or SAS or Mathematica or whatever du jour, what is it,
Yeah.
JASP, you know, all the acronym soup. That's
Yeah.
icing on the cake, and it's just gonna confuse a lot of them and give them stuff that they're never really going to need. Now, I think there are some underlying skills there.
Mhm.
I know we're not talking about the topic you wanted to. The ability to follow
I think
instructions, that ability to do that deep critical thinking, to interpret statistics, I do think there are some skills there, but the mechanism, SPSS per se, will
yeah.
not be relevant to most of our graduates' lives.
Yep. Agreed. And I think I just saw our friends at STP, that great organization. I bookmarked it, but I haven't read it yet. I think some group within STP just released some standards for, was it statistical literacy?
They released some resources. One of Susan Nolan's task forces last year
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
worked,
yeah, yeah.
and they created some resources, and I believe they're available on the website.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Glancing through that, but I haven't read it in depth, so I could be way off. But glancing through that, it looked like they're emphasizing some basic, really solid conceptual understandings within those standards. It didn't look like they were going too far into inferential either.
Yeah, and I think either that group or a subset of that group also took a deep dive into what might be the statistical literacy goals for an intro psych course.
Cool. That might have been what I was looking at.
Yeah. So
Yeah. Nice.
anyway, I didn't mean to detract or distract from your original topic. Intro since I think fall of '09,
Mhm.
but I did have some favorite stories in there.
Mhm.
Do you have one off the top of your head? Because I have one I can go to immediately.
Since we No, you go. You first.
So I had let's see, it would have been in the brain and behavior, talking about the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. And I had some PowerPoint slides about this, and I've actually written a little bit about this example. So and plus anyway, students get a kick out of it. You'll see why. So when I was 16 years old, I worked at Six Flags Great America. It was originally Marriott's Great America. This, by the way, what I'm about to tell is a completely true story. And I've told this story at conferences before. And it was outside of Chicago, 7 miles from where I grew up in my hometown. I worked there all my high school summers, all my college summers. And one of the benefits of working there was that you could go any day for free when you weren't working. So I was 16 years old, I had a car, I had a day off. Or actually, maybe I was going in. Actually, I was going in later that day. I had like a closing shift. I worked food service. And one of the things that students have a hard time imagining is that I had a date with a girl who also worked at the park. So a cheap date for me, I suppose. And we had gone in early. I was coming home about 2:30, 3 o'clock, coming, just on a 2-lane road, coming up to an intersection, and we see a car crash at the intersection. And we kind of see, the cars crash, and we see like bumpers flying and glass flying. We're maybe, I don't know, 50, 75 feet, kind of coming up on it. And we see this and pull off to the side of the road. And her name was Dawn. And so Dawn and I get out of the car, and we run up to the intersection. And when I'm telling this story to my students, you see a real life car crash. You're not watching it on TV. And so I start talking about my heart pounding. My heart starts to pound, and I'm running up. And in one car, there's an older couple, they're really shaken. The cars had spun around in the intersection. They got T-boned or something. And the older couple seems okay, but they're shaken. And the other car, I want to say late 30s, early 40s driver, gets thrown from the car. This would have been 79. So seatbelts were out there. No cell phones, though. Seatbelts are out there. He gets thrown from the car into a ditch. And I think Dawn is taking care of the older couple. I'm looking at the guy in the ditch. And I was 16 years old. I didn't know anything. He's bleeding from the ear.
Ooh.
I learned after the fact that if you're bleeding from the ear from an injury, it's a serious injury. People don't normally bleed from the ear. I lay him down in the ditch and I'm 16. Are you okay? What can I do? I'm going to go run to the nearest house and call for an ambulance. And my chest is pounding. I can feel I'm just ready to do whatever I need to do. And Rob, every part of this story is absolutely true. I remember it like it was yesterday. And the guy says to me, "Make sure my daughter gets everything."
Oh,
And I say, "You're gonna be fine. You're gonna be don't please don't worry about that. Please don't say that." He says, "Make sure my daughter gets everything." So, and again, my students knowing me, 2009 now, I actually run to, maybe 25 yards back to a house on the corner, knock on the door. I don't think they'd seen the accident. I say, "May I come in and use your phone?" And, this is back in the day where you got to dial zero. There is no 911 yet. So dial zero, talk to the operator, get put through to the police. It takes a few minutes, but I don't remember how long it took. I go back, I try to comfort the guy. I don't move him because I don't know what to do. I'm 16 years old. The police come, ambulance comes. I'm still hyper. I'm still hyper. I was supposed to work that night at Great America. I think I got to my shift late, but I go home, change clothes. I take Dawn home, and it's 7, 8 o'clock at night, and finally, my heart starts to calm down. And when I retell this story in class, I get to talk about the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous systems. And I talk about the return to normal being homeostasis. And actually, when I tell the story, um, e- even as I just did right now, recalling it, my heart ramps up,
yeah,
retelling this story, and it will calm down in a couple minutes. The sympathetic kicks in, and then the parasympathetic will be the return to normal. And you
yeah.
can read about it in a textbook, and you can read the words on a page and memorize them for a test. But when I tell that story of the 16-year-old me, a real life story, it's much more vivid, much more memorable for my students on a test. And
No.
plus, I'm not kidding, that was all real. And about 2 weeks later, just to finish the story, um, I get a call from a lawyer or somebody in a law office asking me to retell the story because I don't know who was suing who or who was investigating. And actually, the gentleman in the ditch eventually died. So maybe
Oh,
that was
wow.
the reason why. So
Good
that's
job.
pretty memorable for a 16-year-old. Anyway, I didn't mean to bring you down, but
No.
that kind of story, it, you can't do that for all 160, 180 terms you might cover in a semester of intro
Right.
psych. But when you can connect the concepts to something, a lived experience of your students, or at least for me, it's easy to remember sympathetic,
Mhm.
parasympathetic, homeostasis, fight or flight, these concepts really come alive. So
Absolutely, and it's also so humanizing, both for our relationships with students, but also it it shows students that the concepts that we're learning are real human concepts that really relate to people, and that can often get lost as students are slogging through a textbook or just trying to memorize terms for a test.
absolutely. And plus, when I tell this in class, I do it's pretty serious. So I interject some humorous moments like there was once a time when people dated me, they get a kick out of that. And B, there was once a time where I could run, they get a kick out of that. So, I can do some self-deprecating humor as well.
That's really good.
So you got a
Uh,
story?
Sure. One of them is so this isn't necessarily one that I tell students, but I definitely talk with psychology teachers about it because talk about humanizing. But Bill McKichy, beloved Bill McKichy. If anybody listening to this doesn't know who Bill McKichy is, stop the podcast now and do some Google searching on Bill McKichy and teaching tips. And Bill McKichy at Michigan should loom large in the intellectual lives of all of us who teach introductory psychology. In many ways, he's one of our godparents. He taught many of the people who taught me how to teach and who I admire. Did you ever get Bill? You got Bill on psych sessions.
We did. We got Bill
Yeah,
on psych sessions in 2018, and actually STP very generously funded Garth and I to go to him in Michigan when he was already in a nursing home, and we recorded him.
fantastic.
And it's I don't this isn't going to be exactly correct, but it's around episode 35 on psych sessions. Yeah.
Great. So that'll be one of the lasting values of psych sessions in addition to a whole bunch of other lasting value. But you and Garth and others were able to talk to some really important people in our field
Yeah.
and document their thoughts in a way that hadn't been documented before. So thanks for that.
Yeah, just while we're there, I know I want you to tell your story, but Charles Brewer as well. And what
Yeah.
we didn't know at the time is that we went to South Carolina and talked to Charles about 3 weeks before he passed away.
Yeah.
So
And Albert Bandura.
yeah, I think that was a few months before he
Mhm.
passed away. But yeah, Garth went to California and talked to him as well.
Yeah.
So anyway,
So my
yeah,
Dr. McKee so my Dr. McKeechee story, Ken Keith, another one of my heroes and friends, used to run a summer high school psychology teaching institute at Nebraska Wesleyan University. It was a 2-week institute. The model at the time was month-long institutes funded by the National Science Foundation. And Ken, being clever, figured out a funding stream for a 2-week one, which was much more doable for most high school teachers rather
yeah,
than giving up a month of their summer. And he would have guest speakers fly into Lincoln and give a talk to high school teachers as part of the institute. Charles Brewer was there, and several other folks that we know got to do that institute. And one year he got Bill McKeechee to come in and give a talk, and it was fantastic. Bill came and met with teachers during the day and saw some of the work that we were doing. And then he gave his invited address that night, and his invited address was wonderful. He was of course very well prepared in his Bill McKeechee way, and he brought data from his history of teaching large introductory psychology sections at Michigan, and he did really unique things with that where students, at least at the time, he was allowing students to buy whatever intro psych textbook they could get the cheapest or borrow from somebody, or he didn't care what intro psych textbook you used
hmm
for the class. And then he would deliberately build that into his class where students were comparing how different concepts and studies were treated across different intro books to get them thinking critically about how secondary sources and like textbooks talk about primary sources. So it was really clever. So he gave the talk, and that was great. And then he did a Q&A session at the end, and these are high school folks, and many of them didn't have a big background in psychology, so don't have a deep knowledge base. That was one of the reasons they were at the institute. But there was a few questions at the end. One teacher I remember was toward the end of the Q&A, and I remember the teacher being super hesitant, but the teacher really wanted to ask something but didn't really know what to ask yet. But this is the teacher told me afterwards. But thought of a fairly generic question and raised her hand and said, "Dr. McKeechee, you've been teaching introductory for many years. My students, I've just been teaching high school psychology for a year or so, but I can already tell that the difference between negative reinforcement and punishment is difficult for my students to remember, and it's often mistaken in the media. Do you have
okay.
any hints? How do you help your students learn the difference between negative reinforcement and punishment?" And Dr. McKeechee I remember him standing up on the stage for a second and thinking, and then he launched into the story. And I saw teachers look at each other as he was telling the story because they thought that maybe he didn't hear the question right. Because he started telling a story, and the story started something like, I used to take walks with Fred around the lake at University of Michigan, and we would have these long conversations. And sometimes we agreed about things. We agreed about things often, but we often disagreed about things too. And the high school teachers were looking at each other. Dr. McKichy telling a story about taking a walk with his friend Fred around the lake. And then Dr. McKichy goes on and says, and I told Fred, Fred, those are dumb terms. You're going to confuse people. Nobody's ever going to remember the difference between negative reinforcement and punishment. You just need to change the terms to something that people will actually remember. Think about undergraduate students and what you're dooming them to. And then the ripple went across the audience as people started to realize that Dr. McKichy was talking about taking a walk with B.F. Skinner, who he called
Yeah.
Fred. And he was
Yeah.
telling B.F. Skinner that the terms negative reinforcement and punishment were dumb and telling him to change them. It was super cool. Talk about humanizing. As high school psychology teachers, boy, since we often don't have deep course experience in college, we I don't think we get the sense of research and researchers being real and having those kind of conversations. Sometimes the stuff that's in the textbook kind of feels scriptural, like it's sacrosanct and got handed down from on high.
That's a
Not that
great
people
word.
argued about the terms, and that somebody like BF Skinner might have made a really bad mistake, according to Bill McKichy. And I happen to think that Bill McKichy was right, and BF Skinner probably should have made up different terms for him.
Yeah, scriptural is a I gotta work that into the title of this episode because that is a really good term. And there was a memorial for Bill in November of 2019 at the University of Michigan. And a handful of people were invited to speak, and I was very, very pleased and very honored to be invited to speak, and as well as Jane Hallinan. And what Jane and I did, I may have told this on the podcast already. I apologize if I'm repeating myself. We both went a day early and we spent time in, I'm going to forget the name of it, Bentley Memorial Library, where he has a great deal of his archival. The
Hmm.
McKichy archives are the Michigan version of the archives. And we spent an entire day going through his archives. And Bentley Historical Library. And I have a scan of it somewhere, but I have correspondence between Bill and Fred about the
Wow.
terms. And
Wow.
where
Really?
where Bill made notations in pencil when he wrote back, when he was going to write back to talk about conditioned and unconditioned don't make any sense. And how he's
That's
gonna write back,
fantastic.
and I think he had correspondence from Fred. I know he did on Harvard Stationery.
Wow.
And, "Please give Jeannie my best. We really enjoyed being with you in Ann Arbor last summer. We hope to host you, in Cambridge on your next visit." Just, these legends having these, "Hey, next time you're here, we'll go out on the lake," "Hopefully your kids are doing well." The kinds of, friendship that you and I have, although we're not legends, right? We're not doing the original
Right.
source material for chapter
Right.
16, or
Right.
chapter 6 in the intro psych textbook.
Yeah.
Yeah, y- yeah, I can imagine how impressed everyone in that room was when they heard that from Bill
That's cool.
McKichy.
And now, since you and I told the story to each other, I've got something to add to the story that there's documentation of their correspondence back and forth about conditioned and unconditioned in terms. And now you can tell the story from Nebraska Wesleyan where Bill was taking a walk around the lake with Fred.
Yeah, and I have it somewhere, and I know the original is I know where it is in Ann Arbor. It's in a library, and somewhere in me before I retire, I've got a McKichy project that collects all those archives
Neat.
and makes them available somehow to the public easily. Not quite sure how that works. Let's see, do I have another story that I tell or example? I think the other one when I've told this one. I'm almost positive I've told this one before. The Albert Bandura on our podcast.
Tell me
I'll
more.
tell it again. Maybe
Okay.
people probably don't listen in order, or maybe they don't even listen. So as Psychi Regional Vice President for 2 years, I got to invite speakers for the Rocky Mountain Psychological Association meeting, and so I got to invite whoever I wanted to come be the Psychi Distinguished Lecturer. So in 2010 in Denver, I invited Albert Bandura. In 2011, I invited Elizabeth Loftus. So I had at that time, the world's most famous English speaking male psychologist and female psychologist, which is a pretty good gig for me to be able to do
Cool.
that. But I'll talk about Albert Bandura since he's no longer with us. And we're really fortunate to be able to hear and see Elizabeth Loftus at today's conferences. But I corresponded with him for a long time, didn't get a response. Finally got a response from him via email. And I've actually got it framed in my office. And I took a printout of it with me to Denver, and he very kindly signed it, which is
Oh,
kind of
wow.
cool. And I have it framed with an envelope from him that when he mailed receipts to me to get reimbursed for some of his expenses. But it's got Albert Bandura, the David H. Starr lecturer at Stanford University. It's in a very nice frame. But anyway, but Albert Bandura got in. One of my colleagues told me he got in, and I go to his room and knock on the door, introduce myself, and he says, "I'm hungry." So I said, "I'd be happy to take you to dinner." He gets in, and I go find. I I'm a little intimidated to go to dinner with him by myself. So I go find Nancy Carlin, University of Northern Colorado, Cheryl Sanders from Metro State University in Denver. And the four of us walk to a Mexican restaurant that's within decent walking distance of the hotel. And we sit there for 2 hours and have this amazing dinner with Albert Bandura in the booth of a Mexican restaurant. And I'm a kid in a candy store.
Wow.
I ask him every question I can think of to ask him. I mean, and unfortunately for him, I was in the outside part of the booth seat, so he was blocked in. So I mean, he kind of he answered everything, and I got to introduce him before his invited address, and I had it written out in big font. I knew I was going to be nervous, and one of the cutest things was he heckled me. He actually interrupted his own introduction and heckled me. I've been heckled by Albert Bandura, clearly one of the nicest humans who ever lived, yet he heckled. It was great. And one other thing about that, it was at the time the highest attendance RMP ever had, maybe about
Wow.
750, 800 people. But he was gentle, he was kind. He posed for pictures with Psychi chapters. He posed for pictures with individual students. He signed books, he signed uninflated Bobo dolls. He was gentleman's gentleman. If anybody could have been a prima donna anywhere, it could have been him. He wasn't. He was awesome.
That's awesome. One thing that you and I have talked about before that story connects to for me, you and I talked in a previous episode about lamenting the lack of in-person conferences, and Zoom conferences in some ways have been an interesting replacement and the best that we could do, but you and I both preferred in-person conferences. I know there are arguments Zoom conferences are actually increase access. They increase access for folks who can't travel to in-person conferences. They increase access for some people with some physical limitations who find it really difficult to go to physical conferences, and they're cheaper for people. So there's a lot of potential advantages to Zoom conferences, and I'm sure that some aspect of Zoom conferences will stick around for a long time. But one thing that they can't replace are people you really want to talk to getting trapped with you at dinner.
Right.
Or yeah.
Yes. And, as we're recording this in the past week, I have been to the 2022 Eastern Psychological Association meeting in New York City. And it was delightful to see some of our buddies again face to face and
Mhm,
have a chance to go to dinner or sit in a bar and have a drink. But one of the keynote speakers at EPA was Claude Steele, and
mm,
the ballroom was packed. I would say
yeah.
I can't. I'm not good at estimating this. I would say 400 to 500 people in the ballroom for Claude Steele, and he presented over Zoom. And I didn't know that at the time, and I also would presume that there were really good reasons. I don't know if he just couldn't travel, if there was a health issue, none of my business knowing that. But I gotta tell you, I was also disappointed. Now, I wasn't gonna go up and say hello, I don't have that
Mhm,
relationship with him. I've met him a couple of times. He would not know me from Adam, let's be clear about
mhm.
that. But still, when you go to a rock concert, you know, do you wanna see Aerosmith live, or do you wanna see Aerosmith on a big screen? Again, I'm I and And I think actually, I know because, the EPA President Bonnie Smith mentioned this. When the invitation was first made, the plan was for him to be there in person. I think he wanted to be
Mhm.
there. I think whatever conditions had happened, it was just safer for him to be on the screen. You know, to the extent that we can do this, it is nice to see people in person. But you're right, there's all kinds of equity reasons for, um, Zoom or
Mhm.
electronic, and I hope we can do hybrid. I hope we can do
Yeah.
both. Why can't we give that access and allow an international audience to cut expenses for some, but allow for people to be in person as well?
Yeah, that'd be cool. While we're talking about luminaries in high school psych, and I bet this is true of many college level intro psych classes, the history of psych section of the textbook and that topic is a bit of a dilemma because it's often not the most jazzy or sexy section that students are immediately attracted to. And at least in high school psych, at least in APs, the AP psychology class, it's definitely not emphasized on the test, which isn't a great reason to not teach it, but that is an influence to teach AP psychology teachers who are already short on time. So I think a lot often the history of psychology, the rich history of psychology gets short shrift in a lot of high school psychology classes. But these stories are a way to integrate important parts, I think, of the history of psychology back into the a high school psychology class in compelling ways that can help students understand other concepts. And the other side benefit is it helps students integrate knowledge they have of history along with knowledge they're learning of psychology. So, my example in Nebraska comes via our friend Ludi Benjamin, all praise be unto his name, and his history of psychology, one of his history of psychology texts. He tells the story of a guy named Harry Kirk Wolff, who is not who I believe is a psychology luminary, but not as nearly as popular a name as B.F. Skinner or Albert Bandura or the rest. But Harry Kirk Wolff, it's an important story for us in Nebraska. Harry Kirk Wolff was principal of Lincoln High School, where my daughter attended. He was only principal there for a very short period of time. Then he also was a psychology professor at the University of Nebraska Lincoln, and Dr. Benjamin just tells a great story about him and follows his life arc and his intellectual life and his personal life intertwined in really compelling ways. And I recommend if anybody wants to know the rest of the Harry Kirk Wolf story, find the articles about him written by Ludi Benjamin. But some of the highlights are Harry Kirk Wolff devoted most of his academic career to teaching psychology rather than coming up with theories that bear his name, which might be one of the reasons why he's not in the textbook. He was a pioneer of doing research with undergraduate students, spent his own money setting up an undergraduate psychology lab in the basement of what is now Love Library on the UNL campus. And his courses were incredibly popular because he was actually getting students involved in things. And it's also a valuable story for high school psychology students to hear, I think, because they've learned a lot about historical context of the time in their US history class. This was around 1910, between 1910 and 1920. And in Lincoln, I'm able to ask students, okay, Herr Kirk Wolff studied in Leipzig, Germany, and married a German woman, and his wife spoke with a German accent. And everybody knew that he'd studied in Germany at the time. So in Lincoln, Nebraska, around 1916, 1917, what do you suppose the attitude towards German Americans were in our part of the country? And one student or more will make the connection. Oh, yeah, there was that anti German sentiment. I heard they used to teach German at high schools in Lincoln, but then they stopped right because of World War One. And I said, you're absolutely right. Guess what happened? And then I'll use some of the primary sources that Dr. Benjamin uses, like the Omaha World Herald banner headline that said traitors at UNL. And Harry Kirk Wolff was listed apparently for no other reason other than the fact that he'd studied in Germany. And it turns out that he owned more war bonds than anybody else in the city of Lincoln. And there was absolutely no evidence that he was a traitor, and not even close to that. But they convicted him anyway of lack of enthusiasm for the war effort, which destroyed his academic career. And I think he came to Montana for a while.
That part of the story I wouldn't be familiar with. Yeah.
Okay, I will find that. I will send it to you because I think he left UNL for a time and taught at the University of Montana and then came back, but was drummed out of UNL eventually and had to try farming. And he was a really good academic and not a very good farmer.
But that's the
And
kind of thing that I would love to have Ludi Benjamin tell that
yeah,
story orally
yeah,
and record
yeah.
it. I mean, it's great that it's
Yep.
written, and that's important, but and,
Ooh,
you
I
know,
wonder if he'd tell that on psych sessions.
that that's a harder ask, and I'll
I
tell you
understand,
about
I
it
understand.
sometime when we're
Yeah, I
not
understand.
recording. Uh,
Yeah, I understand.
uh, and just to kinda put the bow on that one, and every year at the APA convention, there are several G. Stanley Hall distinguished lectures that are named,
Mhm.
but I also wanna acknowledge there is also a Harry
Yes.
Kirk Wolff lecture, and
Mhm.
I'm honored to report that one year I gave the Harry Kirk Wolff lecture, and I had
Yay.
actually done a little bit of research on him and presented that at the
Yeah.
beginning of my talk. So,
How'd I do on the details? I haven't told that story in a long time.
you went way deeper than I ever went, so I'm sure you did great as you always do, so
Yeah. So those kinds of history connections, I tell that story when I'm talking about the early history of psychology and the University of Leipzig and Wilhelm Wundt to help students understand really the how quickly the science of psychology came to the United States and a little bit about the spread in the United States.
yeah, there's also some work being done by my colleagues and friends, Leslie Cramblett Alvarez at University of Denver, Nikki Jones at Colorado Mesa, and I know others have done the work before them about, when you're reading those chapters early in the intro psych book, where are the women? And there's lots of discrimination that went on. Women did work at Harvard University, PhD level work, but Harvard wouldn't issue the PhD, so they got their degree from Radcliffe. I mean, there's a lot of BS that went on about that. But Leslie and Nikki have been collaborating on some things about studying that influence of um, female psychologist contributions and how they were squashed and what impact, where are they in that history? And other people have done, very similar things before them, but they've kind of brought it to the 2020s, so to speak. And I think they've got a manuscript in press, and I know they've made some conference presentations about their work.
Neat.
So that
That's a
might make it a
topic in
little
high
bit more
school.
readable for students to, if
Yeah.
it were a little bit more balanced and it wasn't all about dead white men.
Yeah. And that gives me an idea. There are some high school psych teachers who are interested in how to infuse more of our equity conversations into the high school psychology class. And there are also some high school psychology teachers who start the class with social psychology, and it's a really good hook for students. And also, you can use social psych to talk about the experimental method and to talk about research methods in general. And you can even do some data analysis with some social psych. So it might be a way to teach research methods. You could, if once students learn some principles of social psychology with stereotyping and prejudice and fundamental attribution error and some of those social psych concepts, students could gain experience using social psych concepts to interrogate the early history of psychology in a cool way. So, knowing what you know about social psych and implicit bias and stereotype threat and things like that, let's look at the early history of the science of psychology to maybe figure out how those social psych principles maybe influenced who got to be involved and who didn't get to be involved and why.
I thought you were going to go a different direction. I thought you were going to go, you could rearrange the chapters of an intro psych
Mhm.
course and call it a social justice course.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
you could frame it as a social justice course and, you
Mhm.
know, measure the impact of it. You could design
Ye
interventions. You could collect
Mhm,
data. I mean, you'd still
mhm.
be teaching intro psych. You would just have a particular lens. It would have a
That would
particular
be interesting.
flavor or approach.
Yeah,
Yeah, you'd still get
yeah.
all the concepts, but it would have an applied focus.
And I think that would actually fit with the IPI. I've been thinking about the IPI cross-cutting themes for a while, and that
Oh,
might be a
that was
really
not a
interesting
Freudian
thing.
slip. If you look at your
Whoopsie.
Instagram, that was not a Freudian slip. If you look at the IPA, I mean IPI.
You're right. I only think about the IPI when I'm drinking IPAs.
There you go. And for me, IPA is the Idaho Psychological Association. So, there are
Oh, there you go.
multiple interpretations there, my friend.
You should probably have a branded microbrew called the IPA IPA.
Oh my gosh, the IPA squared.
Yeah, there you go.
I think the phrase here is that we're almost officially done.
The IPA States of Consciousness Ale.
Oh no, you've been thinking about this. You have a label design already?
I bet we can come up with one. Mm.
I think we just go to labeldesign.com or we go to Fiverr. I don't know if you're familiar with Fiverr. Fiverr.com.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I'm sure someone would design our beer label for $5.
I bet somewhere Garth is thinking Garth's ears just picked up because we just started thinking about this topic.
Yeah, let's see. What would the story brand? Yeah, he's all into the book story brand. He's probably got it storyboarded out and he's probably already got a designer working on it, but before we release this
Probably.
episode. Yeah.
I like it.
Well, my friend, anything else that you want to add?
No, this was fun, Eric. Thanks.
It was fun. Thank you for coming prepared. Thank goodness one of us was.
Maybe we'll have another story episode in the future. Now that we're thinking about them, I bet we'll both write a few more stories down.
Well, I'll tell you what, and to be surprisingly serious, I think life's all about stories. I
Yeah.
think this is what we pass from generation to generation. We tell stories with our families. We tell stories with our colleagues, with our friends. We tell stories when we gather together at holidays. We regale what happened to us as kids, and our parents and grandparents do that. It's actually all about stories, quite frankly.
Yeah. Including a lot of pedagogy, I think, if we mapped teaching pedagogy advice onto storytelling advice, I bet we'd see a lot of connections.
I think the effective pedagogy for sure. The pedagogy of here's a list of words, memorize and regurgitate
Right.
sentences
Right.
can't possibly be
Right.
a long-term effective strategy for learning and
Right.
retention and then subsequent application.
Agreed.
Yeah. All right, my friend. Thank you for this episode. Appreciate it.
You bet. Good to see you again.